Welcome to Derek, which is the Hebrew word for meditating on the way. Derek, the way. And this is our weekly psalm cast. And today we're at Psalm 11. And my name is John Mark Hicks.
My name is Bobby Valentine. We do want to welcome you to Direct, which is our Psalmcast, where we think about the Psalms, the literary sanctuary of the Bible that draws us in to live before the Lord in integrity. And as He guides us through His Spirit on a certain way of living before Him. And sometimes that path, the direct, has challenges. And we'll see that in Psalm 11 today, but where do we put our anchor? Where do we hold on to? And I think this psalm helps us with that.
Yeah,
So,
this is
welcome.
a yeah, this is a powerful, short, brief psalm,
Yeah,
seven
only
verses.
7 verses. Yeah,
Yeah, but what it addresses and how it addresses it is just kind of it's succinct, but it is profound, I think.
it is. It
And
is.
so we're gonna look at it in some detail, Bobby. But give us a context here for Psalm 11. What how is
Okay.
this fitting in the Psalter itself?
Absolutely. It's a good question, and it's a question to always ask, even of the Psalms. Sometimes we think of context only in narratives, but in the Psalter, scholarship in the last generation has really understood that there is a context. And the context of this particular Psalm is Book One. We'll remember that the Psalms, the Psalter, is divided into 5 books on the analogy of the Torah. Book one, basically from Psalm 1, the gateway to the whole Psalter, all the way down to Psalm 41. These Psalms, most of them are from David, um, wrestle with a lot of enemies, struggles before the Lord, uh, people taking pot shots at you, just like in Psalm 3, and then in Psalm 9 and 10, which are right
Yeah,
before our
Psalm
particular
7
psalm
as well.
here, Psalm 7.
Hmm.
And so you see a lot of chaos. You see turmoil in the world, but we claim that God is ruling all. That's what we said in Psalm 1. And Psalm 11 comes in, and I think it sort of answers back and pulls us back to Psalm 1 and Psalm 2, reminding us that if you are on God's team, if you're part of God's people, there are going to be enemies. And the enemies want us to fail. They want us to turn our back on the walk of faith with the Lord. And that can be a struggle. That can be a serious struggle. And we see that around Psalm 11. So, where do we find hope? Where do we find a place to put our foot down? And Psalm 8 reminded us of what creation was supposed to look like. And Psalm 11 comes along and says, you know what? We're going to go back to that. God is king, God is overall. It's just going to refocus how we live because God is in his temple.
Hmm.
And that really is, I think, the mm,
Yeah, yeah,
the
I think it's
anchor. So
yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead. Yeah, I think that's helpful. Remind us of Psalm 2, the enemies there in Psalm 2, and how God reigns over them, and with the rule of iron, and also as we were talking about before we went on, Psalm 13 is ahead with
Psalm
its how
13 is coming up.
long, and so it doesn't. Psalm 11 says is not a no more lament. It's not that kind of psalm.
Right.
But it says, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the lament, in the midst of the frustrations, here's something to remember. Here's something that you can have take refuge in if you
Exactly.
remember this
Exactly.
moment, this time
I
where
think
Yahweh is.
Yeah, I think a good image for us in our world might be because it has storms and water in it is a hurricane. This is the eye of the storm, so to speak.
Mm.
And the psalms that are around it are swirling around. Where can we go while the storms are raging? Because this one starts out with, hey, I acknowledge that something is going on in the world that is frightening. So
Yeah.
how can I find a place to hold while I'm crying out, how long, O Lord, will you hear me cry, or whatever, as he says in Psalm 13. And that picks up in Psalm 12 as well, right after. So here, this particular psalm, and I want us to remember this particular point when it does talk about the temple, and maybe I'm getting ahead of us. This is not just a structure, this is not just a building for the Israelite. The temple is a symbol. The temple proclaims a certain message to the Israelite. The
Yeah.
God, the creator God, he doesn't dwell in a house made with human hands. The Hebrew Bible doesn't teach that. But he is with us. He is near us. He is dwelling with us. And I think that both the transcendence, which is going to come out in our text, and the immanence of God are something that's what you have in the eye of the storm, in this fact that God is in his temple.
Yeah.
That's
That's
where
right.
you hold on.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, that's good. I like the eye of the storm kind of analogy there. That helps you in the middle of the storm where you're going to find your grounding. And that's
yep,
exactly the question that the psalm raises. So
exactly.
let's read the psalm and then we can walk through it, Bobby. We have such a brief one this time, unlike Psalm 107 or 106 that's 40 some verses long. Here
Yeah.
we can kind of slow down and pay attention to some of the particulars in Psalm 11. But let's begin our reading. Whoa, Psalm, that should be Psalm 11 up there, guys, not Psalm 13. All right, Psalm 11.
Psalm 11. To the leader
Hmm.
of David, in the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to me, flee like a bird to the mountains? For look, the wicked bend the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string to shoot in the dark at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold the gaze. His gaze examines humankind. The Lord tests the righteous and the wicked, and his soul hates the lover of violence. On the wicked he will rain coals of fire and sulfur. A scorching wind shall be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds, and the upright shall behold his face. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Well, I mean, it opens up. Let's talk about the superscription first. For the
Absolutely.
leader of David, which means it belongs to David. That might mean David wrote it. It might mean it's just put in the collection of David.
Right.
That this is the Davidic collection. Uh,
Hmm.
so we don't really know exactly what that means, but it's possible it could mean a number of things. But
Hmm.
comment on what do you mean for the director of music, for the choir leader, or whatever that language is? What is that talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good question too. So the second part for David, whether this is literally from him as being written or for him or in his
Or yeah,
tradition,
could be written
this
to him. Yeah.
yeah, to him. The first part of that, though, indicates that this psalm has been brought together by the editors of the Psalter itself and shows that this particular psalm has a setting in Israel's worship. So, if the Psalter is a hymn book of some sort of the ancient Jerusalem temple, and it's leading God's people, so it functions, I think, in this particular way where David, who is the one in Psalm 2, and the Davidic king is leading God's people in worship. He's the priest king who suffers the anointed Messiah, if you want to, who suffers is often the one who is attacked, and he's leading God's people in worship. But here, this particular phrase does indicate that music is being played. They're singing this song as a way of pulling themselves into a much larger story.
Yeah.
And that is the story of God with his people.
Yeah.
God is walking with David. David may not be historically standing there, but somebody from David's line is leading us in worship. And that very image of that person, God's promises are true.
Yeah.
God is with us.
So
And I
that
think
that
it's
that individual, because it is an I, right? In the Lord,
it
I
is.
take refuge. But it's kind of a plural I. It's an
It is.
I that represents the whole. That
It
is
is.
Israel. We're talking about Israel here. In the Lord, Israel will take refuge. But the
And no.
leader of the assembly, or the one who's leading the song, or
That's
whatever
right.
that looked like, which we don't really have a clear idea about how
Yeah.
exactly that looked. But it's not just an individual psalm. It's a
No,
corporate. It's a
that's right.
corporate psalm. Yeah.
Yeah. I become part of the group, and the group finds
Mm.
fulfillment in me. God's promises are to the group, and I'm part of the group. I'm redeemed. I join the I,
Yeah.
and the I expresses my particular hopes and my faith. In fact, it draws me in.
Mm.
This is the kind of faith I want to have while I'm in the eye of the
Yeah.
storm.
Yeah.
And I can find it with this person over here who represents all of us.
Right.
And I think that's true even in our contemporary setting when somebody is praying in our churches, we often say, he's leading us. I'm praying through that person, they're leading
Mm.
our thoughts.
And we all say
We're
amen.
united.
Yeah.
So, hey, we all
Mm.
say amen to it, and that's
Yeah.
what's going on here.
Yeah.
So
So
it
he
is.
starts with the word refuge. I mean Yahweh begins the sentence in
Yeah.
Yahweh. I take refuge. So
Yeah.
there's two important things there, it seems to me. One is the word refuge, which tells us, okay, something's wrong.
Yeah.
Something's off kilter here. Something's needs to be fixed. There's some
Right.
chaotic dimension to this world he's living in. Uh, and Yahweh is going to be the ground and the protector of the one who is undergoing assault or
Exactly.
undergoing the storm or whatever the storm
Exactly.
might be. And we do get a little description of what the storm is here in just a moment.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
in Yahweh, I take refuge. And that kind of sets the tone for the whole
Yeah.
psalm.
Exactly. He's the defender.
Yeah,
So you see that in Psalm 9 and 10. He's the defender of the oppressed. He protects the widows and the orphans and others who are oppressed. It says that. So here, this person identifies themselves as a person who is in a vulnerable position. They call out to the covenant name of
right.
God, which is
Hmm.
Yahweh.
Right.
And by saying that, you're doing two things. Every Israelite, God is Hesed, and He is the God of the Exodus. He's the one who's brought us out with the mighty hand and outstretched arm. And the refuge, of course, as you've already alluded to, is in fact that's why we need that's the eye of the storm. The refuge is in the eye, that's where
Mm.
it is. And inside the context of book one, that line takes us all the way back to the last verse of Psalm 2, where it says, "Blessed are those who take refuge in the Lord."
Right.
So that's the arc that goes through this book one. It's like, troubles are here, but where can you find a place of shelter in the storm?
Yeah, a place of
And that's his
safety,
refuge.
right?
It's absolutely, that's
Yeah.
exactly where you go. And,
Yeah.
I think that you're right. Man, this is why we're here. That's chapter 2, verse 12, I think, and
Hmm.
Psalm 2 for
Yeah,
finding that
it really
refuge.
does help to see how the Psalms play off each other and the
Absolutely.
interconnections of the language and what the language that's repeated, the words that are repeated. And that gives us a sense that the Psalter is not just a hodgepodge of
Yeah, that's
chaotically
right.
and randomly selected
Yep,
psalms and put together in
exactly.
some kind of random way. No, there's a story being told through the whole Psalter and the connections
Absolutely.
between the psalms.
Absolutely.
So let's
Absolutely.
look at the situation that we have here, what you read in verses 1 to 3, as kind
Yeah.
of 1b through 3, but particularly the situation in 1 and 2, I guess. What is happening? What's going on? I mean, the psalmist seems to be either responding to what somebody else has said or maybe responding to his own inner turmoil.
Right.
How are
Right.
you thinking about that?
Well, I think it could possibly be either one. I'm not going to get real dogmatic about it. But either way, and I think if you understand the end of verse 2, that there's actual danger, somebody is lurking, they want to shoot an arrow in the dark, it says. So they're hiding. This is secret. This is something, an
Mm.
undetected
It's kind of
danger
like at night or
that
something.
that's right, at
Yeah.
night. And how do you protect yourself against an arrow that's shot in the dark? I mean,
Mm.
how do you do that? In the daytime, we've all seen the movies where they fire their arrows and you can see it going through the sky and you can put up your shield and maybe protect it. But in the dark, how do you do that? You can't. So this person, if they're talking to themselves, and that's probably where I'm at, I look at stuff and I get afraid. I see the wind blowing around me. I see the chaos, man. It's about to blow over me. And you've been there. I've been there. Other people watching us have probably been there where things just, man, that wind can rip you to shreds, just
Right.
absolutely go through you. And it picks up on that later on. God's going to send the shiraku to the wicked. I mean, how do you stand up against that? God, creation does what he wants it to do, to
Hmm.
hold up his position for the righteous. And so when I look at that, and it's terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
And I say to myself, man, I need to run away. I need to get out of here. That's the flying like a bird,
To flee,
If
right? Hmm.
flee, if you go to the mountains,
You can go hide.
the storms are
Yeah.
not there,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
It's like
You can
so
hide.
escape the temptation. This is the temptation in the face of that storm is to escape.
Right. Let me
That's the temptation.
let me comment on two things there. One about the dark. I think there's almost kind of a sinister dimension to dark
Oh,
there.
absolutely.
There's
Yes.
this hostility that is involved. I mean, they're shooting arrows, so it's hostile, right?
Absolutely.
But there's a sinister, cloaking, secretive sort of thing going on. And to flee to the mountain, at least as the psalmist is expressing it here, to flee to the mountain is to flee to another sort of refuge.
That's right.
I'm going to go find refuge in my hiding. I'm going to go find refuge in the cave, in the mountain. I'm not
Hmm.
going to find refuge in the Lord. I'm going to find refuge somewhere else. And so I
That's
think
right.
we have this choice of where are we going to center ourselves? Are we going to
Yeah.
center ourselves in our capacity to protect ourselves, our capacity to make it right, our
Yeah.
capacity to fix it? Or are we going to take refuge in the Lord and trust what the Lord is going to do with God's own world?
Yeah. And if you're coming to this with the biblical story in the background,
Well, of course
uh,
you must. You
you
must come
know,
with the
yeah,
biblical
yeah,
story in the
just like you're
background.
coming. So, there's a prophet who did this.
He
He
went to the
ran into
mountain.
some. He went. His name is Elijah, and he
Yeah,
ran to a mountain that historically was associated with God Himself.
yeah,
And then all of a sudden, the voice says, "What are you doing here?"
yeah.
No, don't come here. I want you out there.
Yeah, remember
So, I
he
mean,
ran to the mountain after a victory.
after the
Yeah,
victory,
after the victory, the prophets
that's
of
right.
Baal.
The
But then
first Kings chapter
Jezebel,
18. So
then
then
Jezebel threatens him.
exactly.
So the wicked are pulling their bow back to shoot at Elijah. And what does he do?
Exactly.
He runs to the mountain. Now,
That's
he's
what he
running to the
does.
mountain of God in that sense,
Yeah.
right? He's going to Horeb. So, in one sense, he's running to God, but he
Well,
doesn't
he
trust
thinks.
God. Well, he thinks, right?
That's
That's what
right.
he thinks he's doing. But in another sense, he's running because he's scared and
He's
he's not
afraid.
taking
That's right.
refuge. He's not taking refuge in the Lord
Exactly.
in the
That's
situation.
right. Yeah. And this person who says these things perhaps to themselves, it's not just that these arrows are flying through the darkness, and I agree that's kind of sinister, but it's towards these are the enemies of Psalm 2. They are shooting at the upright
Right.
in heart.
The wicked, right.
That's right. The wicked are shooting at, and why? The world has got to be screwed up if they're shooting at the righteous. The righteous, you'd think if society is the way it's supposed to be, then everybody's protected, especially those who are walking with the Lord. But here it is those who are walking with the Lord, the upright in heart, are those who are walking on the derrick. He's
Right.
like, no, they're they're shooting at the people who are trying to live the way God wants them to live.
Right.
So this is what causes serious angst in this person to want to fly away. The scoffers, and that's what they're called in Psalm 2, or in even Psalm 1, the scoffers, man, they are intimidating people. You know, the prophets of Baal and Jezebel are certainly a manifestation of that, where even the prophet of God can be intimidated, as you said,
Mhm.
even after his victory on Mount Carmel, that he runs away to a mountain, he flies like a bird,
Yeah.
and we get intimidated. Where do
Yeah.
we find the place to hold on to? And I think that's what's so powerful about this particular song, because it, in such a short period, it just says, this is it.
Yeah. So I think you're right. This, it's important to see in verse 2 the contrast between wicked and righteous, because
Yes.
that's going to come back at the end of the psalm, this wicked and righteous. And
Yeah.
it's that conflict that creates the uncertainty,
Yeah.
the chaos, the vulnerability, because
That's
they're
right.
shooting at the righteous. And if they're shooting at the righteous, what does that say about the status of the world or the state of the world? Well, verse 3. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
question.
That's the
When the
foundation.
foundations are
Foundation.
being
Yep.
destroyed, when the
Yep.
wicked are just tearing the foundations down, what can the righteous do? What are we supposed to
Exactly.
do? Flee?
Exactly.
We're supposed to flee? Is that what we're supposed to do?
Yeah.
Oh, we
Yeah.
take refuge. Right.
Yeah, it's almost as if creation is being undone, you know? I mean, this is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to have peace, you know, if we're walking with the Lord. But as we can see in the Psalms surrounding Psalm 11, that's not the case. The enemies are very much alive. In our New Testament world, sometimes we call them the principalities and powers, and the powers, the rulers, and all that kind of jazz.
Right.
They make life uncomfortable for those who are pledging allegiance to the Lamb and his God. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, this and I want to make, before we move on to that, just one more thing, because this is in worship. If this person, this poet, wrote this himself through worship, through the leader, rhetorically, the people who are gathered are allowed to participate and experience the same problem. I
Mhm.
don't have to experience the fright itself. Worship is providing me the vitamins A, B, and C, and D, and B12 in order um, to inoculate me, so to speak, before
Yeah.
the storm comes.
To prepare
This
me.
is,
Right.
it's
Mhm.
right. It gives me a new set of lenses to look. I do see the storm, but if I am pledging allegiance to the king, as Psalm 1 says, then I see a greater reality, which is what the second half of the
Yeah.
psalm is.
Right. It's
There's something else
right.
besides this fear that it 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 deals with that fear. It casts it out, so to
So yeah,
speak.
so I hear what you're saying there, but 1 to 3 is zooming in on a particular situation
Yes,
that creates fear, that creates uncertainty and vulnerability, and we're under attack. But then when you get to verse 4, it zooms out
it does.
and it gives you a big picture and says, okay, remember the Lord.
That's right.
And so in verses 4 and 5, we get this Lord, the Lord, the Lord. This is who the Lord is. This is what the Lord is doing. This is where the Lord is. And how does that respond to the situation, Bobby, that this person is describing?
Well, it reframes the entire thing. It gives us a new way of looking at the world, that what I'm afraid of is really temporary, and that the real world is these people are not the king. These people do not have power. Ultimately, God will take care of them. What I see that recasts the whole thing. I'm afraid. I want to run away. I can only be afraid and run away if I doubt that God is king.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But when I come into worship, and this is how worship reframes our walk with God, it teaches me that the world out there and its claims are fake. The real world is the world that I testified to,
Mm-hmm.
which is that the Lord is king.
Right.
He reigns. I cannot live in fear because, as it says, and we haven't read it yet, but the Lord is in his holy temple. If God, the God of Israel, and notice again, it uses the word Yahweh here.
Yeah.
Yahweh. It's not
And
not
temple.
Baal. It's
Right.
not Marduk. It's not Amun-Ra. It's not some pagan deity. It is the covenant God, the God of Hesed, and the God of the Exodus. He is in the temple.
Mm.
It means he's with us.
Okay.
He's with us.
Or
I
we have
don't.
come to him, right? I
It's
mean,
right.
we're going to see his face. That kind of, we're going to be in the temple,
Well,
experience
that's
his
what it says. The
presence.
very last thing,
Right.
we're going to behold
Exactly.
his face. And
We're
so,
going
yeah.
to
So,
experience his presence. So, yeah, I think when as you're referring to this, you're getting the royal language, the king language from the sense of the heavenly throne. That word throne is
that's
used
right.
in verse 4. So when I see the Lord, the Lord, the Lord, I'm thinking, okay, the first one is about where God is. The second one is about what God is doing,
Yeah.
or God's omniscience, or God's omnipresence, or God. God sees all the sons of Adam, all the children of Adam, all the people of the earth, all human beings, and the Lord examines them, he tries them. So there's a kind of a progression here to get to the point of, God knows what these wicked people are doing.
Exactly.
God sees them, and God's
That's
going to
right.
do something about it. Right? You don't have to be afraid. I can understand
Yeah.
why you might want to flee. I can understand your uncertainty, but God is saying, or the poet is reminding us, this is who God is. This is who Yahweh is, and
Yeah.
trust in Yahweh. Right? I want
Well,
maybe talk more about. Eventually, we'll talk more about that examining. But go ahead. What would you want to say about that?
well, I want to say a lot of things about a lot of
Yeah,
things
go
on
ahead.
that.
Well, go ahead. Say something because we don't want dead air. Okay, so say
Well, we don't. Well,
something.
in verse 4, I think you do. You have two poles there. You have the transcendence. First, you got the immanence of God.
Right in the
He
temple.
is
Yep.
in his temple. God is near. This is Emmanuel. And when we hear this as moderns, this is what I say where I preach and teach, and because we don't understand this language when we're talking about the temple.
Yeah, we don't know temple
This is
language. Yeah.
Emmanuel. God
Hmm.
is with us. This is Jesus being born stuff. God is with us. And at the same time, he is in heaven. His throne is in heaven.
Hmm.
So that's where he can look down and he sees not just Israelites and puny me, he sees all the nations. This is God's sovereignty over the whole world. The God of Israel is not a tribal deity. He looks over
Yeah.
and he examines everybody, including me. He sees me when I come into his throne room. He sees them, which by the way, in Psalm 9 and 10, it says that they didn't think that they would be found out. They didn't think God was going to see them as they were oppressing the
Yeah.
poor, the widows, and the orphans.
Yeah.
But here, again, Psalm 11 is answering this. He does see. He does see. His
Mm.
eyes behold, his gaze examine the sons of Adam, the
Yeah.
children of humanity. Again, this is not Israelites. This is everybody.
Right. So let me
And to
back you
this
up. Let me
person,
back you up there just a moment,
okay,
Bobby. Like the kind of the eminence transcendence. He's in the holy temple. He's in on the heavenly throne. I mean, that's the language we get in Second Kings 8 or Second Kings 6 and Second Chronicles 6, right? Or is it?
yeah.
No, it's First Kings 8 and Second Chronicles and yeah, Second
Talking about
Chronicles 6.
Solomon's prayer.
Yeah, Solomon's
Yeah,
prayer,
yeah,
where he prays in the temple. Okay,
that's
this
right.
is where God is going to come to rest, and the glory of God is going to dwell in the temple. But as he talks about praying, it's about recognizing the presence of God in the temple, but then praying to heaven, where God
That's right.
dwells. So
That's right.
there's the sense of the temple is not a temple is not something that captures God or
Absolutely.
encapsulates God. God is not limited by the temple, but the temple is God's gracious presence among the people where we can see God's face and lift up our prayers to the heavenly throne. That is kind of, then you get this global sense. He's not
Yeah.
just located in the temple, but he has a global work going on where he examines all the children of Adam. Yeah.
Exactly. The temple, in some sense, is almost like a, in our fellowship doesn't like this word, but it's almost like a sacrament. It communicates the presence of God
Right.
with us.
That's why we call it
And
sanctuary, right?
that's right.
Sanctuary.
That's right.
Mm.
And this temple means nothing without God's presence there, and his name dwells there, his glory dwells there, and it is from there, as long as he's there. And this is again going through the story of Israel, the most horrifying thing that Ezekiel can imagine is that the glory of the Lord is leaving the temple. Is
Right.
Ezekiel chapter 11, and is like maybe in chapter 12 of Ezekiel, but right in there, and he's like, he sees the glory of the Lord heading away.
Hmm.
But then as the prophet ends, he also sees, he gets there in chapter 40 and through 48, and it's like, hey, the glory of the Lord, it's off there to the east. It's
Yeah.
coming, it's coming, it's
Yeah.
coming back. And then it ends, and the very last words in that prophet is, the Lord is there. The Lord is there. God is
Um,
with his people. And that's where these people, they hold down their hand. This is their anchor point in the storm. Yes, he's transcendent,
yeah.
he's sovereign, but he is with us, and he's holding me because he's my God. He's my covenant God. He delivered the oppressed. We can never forget that. When you say
Yeah.
Yahweh, he's the one who delivered the slaves. He's the one out of Hesed. He is the God of Hesed. Hesed, Hesed, Hesed. That's the mini Bible we spent some time on. And this one is where, and it's not the temple itself, it's the deity who dwells in the temple, because
Yeah.
he's my God, he's our God, and
Yeah.
he holds us together. And this is where our our anchor holds
Yeah.
in
Let's
the storms.
let's
So,
think about, I think we need to say something at the same time. We got to remember something like Jeremiah's temple sermon, right? In Jeremiah
oh well,
chapter
that's
chapter
right. It,
7.
it,
And that's
it
where this wicked righteous contrast come in.
exactly.
Because it might be that the wicked that are shooting the arrows are people in the assembly itself,
They
that
are.
are
Yeah.
assaulting the anointed one, or whoever is representing here, or they're assaulting Israel because of their
Yeah.
oppression, or the way they treat the widows, or the way they treat the aliens.
Yeah.
Any number of reasons why the wicked are described as wicked here. They're
That's
not
right.
following the way, right? That's
They are
that's the
not
kind. They're not
following the
walking
way.
according to the way. Now, and when you don't walk according to the way, if you shed innocent blood, if you oppress the widows and you mistreat the strangers, the temple sermon in Jeremiah 7 comes into play and says, you can't come to the temple and find refuge, not if you're walking by a different way.
Exactly.
If you are engaged in the oppression, when you are worshiping the liberator of the oppressed,
Exactly.
you're wicked. You're not going to see God's face. You're going to get something else. So the temple is not a place where you can just bring your wickedness and feel good. Now that
Exactly.
you come into the temple and you bring that evil, you bring that life of evil into the temple, and it's going to scorch you. And
It
that's
is
what
going
we
to
say about,
scorch you. That's right.
right.
In fact, in just a couple of Psalms away, you got Psalm 15, where it says, who can dwell on your holy mountain?
Right.
Who can come into your presence? And there it says, the one whose walk, there's our word, blamelessly, and does what is right, who does not slander with his tongue, who does no evil to his friends, doesn't shed innocent, he keeps his oath even when it hurts. These are the kind of people who are walking on the way. These are the
Right.
kind of people who are the upright in heart. And I do want to stress that heart. The Hebrew Bible stresses the heart stuff, over and
Yeah.
over and over. Sometimes is here this inner disposition, my loyalty to God is manifested in the walk that I have before Him. And these people, they
Mm-hmm.
what it's not just that they don't go to Wednesday night church. It's that their walk is a violent one. They
Right.
are not loving their neighbors as themselves.
Yeah. In verse 5,
They're,
it says they
yeah,
love violence.
they
You
love
know, And
violence.
that's in contrast with God, or the Yahweh in verse 7, who loves justice.
That's right.
So, I mean, that's two different ways, right?
It
to love
is.
violence and to love justice.
Yeah. And how do you know that you love violence? Well,
No,
you don't care for the poor. You don't care for the widows. You don't care for the orphans or the aliens. Again, Psalm 9 and 10 are right before this particular psalm, I
yeah.
think on purpose.
They give you a
And
sense of what the righteousness is and what the
exactly,
wickedness is,
exactly.
right?
So it's like, okay, what is going on here? What does it mean? Because sometimes I think that we think, and again, the shooting the arrow, that again that this is metaphorical.
Hmm.
We are in a storm,
But it
but
is a violent act,
I can
right?
shoot. I
Yeah,
can. That's right. I can be a person of violence by simply being a person who does not take care of those who are around me
yeah,
in a loving way. I can
right.
turn a blind eye. I can okay, this has nothing to do with me, but that's not the way of the righteous. The way of the righteous are proactive because the law actually calls us to care for the
Mm.
widows and the orphans, as Moses says in Deuteronomy
Yeah,
10.
it's
You
like
know, I'm like, this is
like in
something.
Mark 12, and Jesus talks about the temple authorities who devour widows'
Oh,
houses. I
oh,
mean yeah,
absolutely.
that sort of thing. So this is the kind of wicked we're talking about here. We're not talking about the little white lie or
Yeah,
the kind of mistakes we make, or we all have moral failings. But
absolutely.
this kind of wickedness is an intent to follow a particular path, a
It is.
particular to walk in a particular way, and the
Yeah,
two way and the passion that God has here is just extraordinary, because it uses language that sometimes Christians are a little uncomfortable with. That
yeah,
God hates with his soul, with his nephesh. God hates deep down in God's own inner being. God hates these acts of injustice,
that's
this
right.
violence against other human beings.
Exactly.
And I think we have to stress that hate. I mean, it's not a malicious hate in the sense of, oh, God's just he's ready to zap somebody, because he just loves zapping people.
Right.
No, it's a just revulsion and
Exactly.
rejection.
Yeah.
People who follow the way of injustice and follow the path of oppression and violence, God has God alienates from them. That God is rejecting them. And we get the language of kind of that burning sulfur. I mean, there's some hellfire and brimstone going on here. When
Exactly.
when God
Exactly.
looks at the lover of violence, those who love violence, God's response is hellfire and brimstone. It's
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
fiery coals and burning sulfur.
Yeah, these words, love and hate, we come to these words in our American culture through a history of romanticism.
Oh yeah,
I
right.
mean,
You're right.
so we're thinking this has to do with my feelings, oh, my feelings and my feelings and my feelings. These have nothing to do whatsoever to do with feelings. That love is a verb, and I so is God's hate is like a verb. God hates. Now, what does that look like? It's going to be his action to judge these people.
Yeah,
His
exactly.
acts of judgment, just like my love is an act of care. Again, John has the same thing in First John. He says, "How dare you say that you love God whom you've never seen, and you hate your brother?" That's the words he uses,
Hmm.
who you have seen. And nobody would say, I don't hate my brother. And John says, well, you know what? You had the wherewithal, you had the physical ability to take care of that person, and you didn't. And he calls that hate.
Right.
That's what John does in First John 4. It's like, so here, when these kind of actions are being taken against certain people, God's wrath, God's hate is manifested in bringing a cessation of that activity that is directed to the poor, the widows, the orphans, the oppressed, the aliens. Again, those are the Psalm 9, 10 folks. Deuteronomy 10, he says, what does the Lord ask of you to do? Circumcise your heart and love the alien, giving them food and clothing because I love the alien. And remember, he says, you were aliens in
Hmm.
Egypt.
Hmm.
So here, and this this bringing about the coals of fire and sulfur. I mean, again, that's a biblical allusion. If you know this, that's people think Sodom and Gomorrah. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. God poured this out. But here again, I have to have a caution here because we don't know our story. We think that God just wiped out this wickedness. And again, it's talking about violence. There's not a word here about sexual sin and all that kind of jazz. And you may disagree with me on this, but when Ezekiel thinks about this kind of stuff, and you go to Ezekiel chapter 16, and he says, what is the sin of Sodom? When you have this allusion to this, it is injustice. They were arrogant and overfed and unconcerned for the poor. And now they had some other disgusting stuff going on, he says, but we can look at those kind
Yeah.
of things, what they are. But those three things, they were arrogant, they were overfed, they were unconcerned for the poor. And what did God do? These people are falling in line with that tradition of being a lover of violence.
Yeah.
And it was, what was it? Arrogance? I'm a glutton. I'm consuming more than what I need, and therefore I don't have anything to share. And I'm unconcerned for the poor. And God said, "Psh."
Yeah. Well,
And
I agree. I agree that that's what's explicit in Ezekiel 16. But I think there's also a violence, like there's at least a violence of rape, right?
in Genesis 19,
in
yes,
Genesis, right?
absolutely. Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
there's a general abomination alluded to in Ezekiel 16.
Well, yeah,
But
general
we don't
abomination.
have to kind of figure that out here. But the point I'm hearing from you is that when you think about Sodom and Gomorrah and the fiery coals and the burning sulfur and that event that where God judges those cities, Ezekiel is quite explicit about the nature of the sin
Exactly.
that at least Ezekiel is pinpointing those sins because those were the sins of Israel as well.
They are.
That,
Yeah, he says,
so
he says theirs are worse.
he's connecting Israel with Sodom and Gomorrah, and
Exactly.
they share the same sin. And I think when you look at this, those who love violence, and they pull their arrow back and make target practice out of the righteous, that hostile attack. Yeah, that's what God is judging.
Exactly.
God's not judging, the here in this text, the sort of things that we think of as, oh, sin that we feel so guilty about. Now we ought to feel guilty for sin, but this is heavyweight stuff, right?
It is.
The
It is.
lover of violence, and that violence, as you're saying, includes not just shedding innocent blood by murdering people, but it also includes the violence against the poor and the widow and the orphan and the stranger.
Absolutely. Exactly.
So,
And I
and
think
that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we need to be aware of that when we're not only in the Psalms, but in the biblical story itself, because we have a tendency, I think, in our restoration and evangelical traditions to bracket out and protect ourselves from being examined by God. God is going to examine us here.
Yeah,
And we
that's key.
bracket out certain things and say, well, I'm not guilty of that, and then, but our own arrogance and our own being overfed and
Hmm.
unconcerned for the poor are things that are coming into focus here that this person says, you know what? God takes notice of this. This is it may not be a big deal to me, but it is a huge deal to the
Right.
Lord. And I think that's what worship is supposed to
Yeah.
do. It's supposed to convert our eyes. I think Clement was the one who said that we come and we have baptized eyes. He says, it's like we go and we see the world through baptized eyes because now I look at the world and I see these people through the reign of God because God is king.
Hmm.
And I have a completely different way of seeing the world than the wicked do.
Yeah.
And
So God then examining humanity, examining the righteous, testing, probing, trying. I mean, there's different ways of translating that word. We've seen that word say in Psalm 139, try.
Absolutely.
It appears in Deuteronomy, it appears in Exodus. I mean Jeremiah particularly. So this is a regular habit on the part of God. God
Oh,
is
absolutely.
testing and trying because God is righteous. That's the reason in verse 7
Yep.
for Yahweh is righteous and Yahweh loves justice.
That's right.
That's the foundation. That's who we want to image. That's who we want to be like. We want to be like God. God is holy, so we want to be holy. Um, in order that living in that way, living according to the way, Derek, the upright will see His face. How do
That's
you
right.
hear that phrase? The upright will see His face.
Well, I I think that what this means is not when they go to the temple, they actually see an image of God, but that they have a divine fellowship with Him. And they are conscious of this. I believe Israelites were quite conscious of a fellowship with God. As Psalm 51 says, take not your Holy Spirit away from me. He knows when God's presence is gone, something is wrong. These
Mm,
Israelites know when they come into the presence of the Lord, their God gives them a a blessing of some sort. I've had it on occasion, and other people have as well, that we come and we know that He is with us.
yeah.
We know that He is walking with us and taking us by the hand. Psalm 23 is going to come along where there's more enemies, and we're eating in the presence of our enemies, but He is with us. His rod and His staff, they comfort me. He is with us because not because I'm perfect, but the Lord is looking and He sees that I am on His side. I confess I am trying to walk along the way and He's with me.
Um,
So it
there's
produces
a yeah. There's an
praise.
allegiance. There's a commitment
Yes,
there to the way. Yeah,
that's
and
right.
but it's what we love.
Um,
We love the way. We don't love violence. We love the way. Now,
that's
we're
right.
not always walking well on the way. We walk badly sometimes, but we're committed to the way, and that's what
That's
we
right.
love. We love the justice of God, the righteousness of
That's
God.
right. And when we fail on the way, it's not because I'm um, rebellious. I'm not
Right.
trying to uh, walk away from God and live. And the fact that I actually come and I ask Him for His hesed, I'm conscious that I need it,
Right.
but I'm trusting in His goodness. And what this does, I think, this second half of this psalm is it tells me that when the day is done, I will be with God.
I will see
You
His
cannot
face.
touch me.
Hmm. Hmm.
I have no reason to live in fear. Now, this takes faith. This is a profound statement of faith here. I am with Him. You can
Yeah.
shoot me, and I might end up getting shot. Jesus did. Jesus died on the cross. But yet He trusted.
Yeah.
He saw that God was in His holy temple, and God rewarded him. I don't have any problem with using that language for Jesus. He rewarded him. He said, I am with you into the grave, and I will bring you out and say you were
Mm.
right, they were wrong.
Yeah.
And that's God's justice vindicating His upright ones. And
Yeah.
not because they have all the answers, but because they simply have faith.
Yeah.
So
So
that's
in
how
that
I would.
sense, in sense, upright see His face, not only in the sense of experiencing God's presence in worship, in assembly,
Yeah.
like at the temple, but also in the hope of the resurrection, to see the face of God, so that we in Revelation 22, and they saw the face of God. They were in
Exactly.
God's presence and saw it. So the upright will see the face of God,
We
whether
will see it.
in worship or in resurrection. Yeah.
Absolutely. And since you've gone there before we close here, the book of Revelation is saturated with the language of the Psalter. And when people are living in fear and wondering where they can hold on in the book of Revelation. Here you got one person, John, representative of all the churches in Asia, being brought into the temple of God, being brought into the presence of God in Revelation 4 and 5. He goes through the door, he passes through, and what does he see? He sees the temple, he sees God sitting on his throne. He's
Heavenly
given
throne.
a vision and says, God's on his temple, on his throne. I have don't fear.
Mm-hmm.
He is in control. Caesar is not king.
Yeah.
Caesar's not king. Yahweh is king. His king, his lamb, his
Mm-hmm.
Messiah is at the right hand side, which again is the temple imagery from Israel. And you're going in there and say, oh, now we can live faithfully in the face of Domitian
Yeah.
or whoever it is. You can't touch me. Now,
Yeah.
you can kill us. We can be martyrs. There's martyrs in the book of Revelation, but we are more than conquerors. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
just reframes the whole thing.
And at
So
the same time, like in the Psalter, chapter Psalm 13 will, how long, O Lord? How long must I have
that's
sorrow in my heart every
exactly what
day?
they say.
And that's what they say in Revelation chapter 6 too. The
That's right.
martyrs are saying, how long?
How long?
So we can have that trust that that dissipates fear, that undermines fear, and at the same time say, but how long?
Yep.
And why?
Yep.
And where are you? We're going to
Exactly.
come to your temple. So, well, that this is a powerful little psalm that
Oh,
has
man.
so much in it.
Absolutely.
And I think it was a good illustration, Bobby, as we walked through it to see the interconnectedness of the language in the Psalter
Hmm.
and throughout the whole story itself. So we don't want to read a particular psalm, in total isolation. Now we want to give it its own integrity, but not in isolation from the rest
Yeah.
of how the editors put this together and link the
Exactly.
language together. Yeah.
Well, it has a unique context where it came from initially.
Yeah.
Then it's used in worship. And then it becomes part of the Psalter. And all of those are by design, and I think each one
Um,
of those contributes to the whole message
and then it becomes
of
part of the worship of the church.
absolutely.
And we see
Absolutely.
it through the eyes of Jesus, right?
Absolutely.
And what
Yeah.
God has done there.
We are
Well,
told to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So
yeah, yeah. We need to do more of that, don't we?
we do.
Well, thanks everyone for being with us. Our time is up. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all.
Amen.
Amen.